So the regulations. So the way it works, both federally, U.S. Code, and in California, Health and Safety Code, we pass a law that we call a statute, codified in the Health and Safety Code. And then we'll write regulations for most, but not all of the statutes. There are exceptions to the rules, where there's exceptions to those rules that were listed in the statute that we do not write regulations for because they're fairly either explanatory or they're very detailed. And one of them that I'll talk about later on is some of the regulatory exclusions and exemptions that are found in the Health and Safety Code in Section 25.143.2, paragraphs A, B, C, and D. Those exceptions to the rules for excluded recyclable materials and recyclable materials for managing hazardous waste in the state of California that are non-RCRA, we don't have regulations written for those. You only find that exception in the actual statute, which is the Health and Safety Code. But most of what we're going to talk about, discuss this program for the next 3 hours and 40 minutes is really predominantly codified in the regulations. We used to call that the California Administrative Code until we became an authorized state in '92, and now we call it a California Code of Regulations. So it's in Title 22. 66-260 through 266-268, plus universal waste regulations. We're going to find those in 273. But the federal requirements for RCRA, of which we've adopted, once we became an authorized state in '92, we find those embellished or enshrined in the California regulations for the most part. And those are found in 40 CFR, Part 260 through 268 and 273 as well. And when we talk about California regulations, we're generally talking about Title 22, California Code of Regulations, 66-260 through 66-268. So that's kind of the main body of what we're going to focus on in this program this afternoon. So, and then similarly to the California Vehicle Code, we adopt stuff out of DOT federally, similar to FedOSHA. That is embellished or enshrined and adopted at the state level in some elements in CalOSHA. So you have a federal equivalent, you have a state equivalent, and you also have the laws. The law is the statute. That's the Health and Safety Code in California. We'll take that, and if you read in Title 22, what's a generator, definitions, time frames, accumulation, characterization, listed waste, characteristic waste, at the end of the section in Title 22, it will actually list from where that regulation was excerpted from or where the regulations were promulgated from, what statute. And it references what health and safety code is actually reinforces or that regulation was written from at the end of each of the topical sections in Title 22. All right. So we have certain terms that are state and we have certain terms that are federal. Some of the state terms include things like industrial waste. An industrial waste was a term that was defined under in 1995 when Pete Wilson was going through the Regulatory Structure Update, or RSU, to try to bring the federal program and the state program in parallel to one another. And this is after we became an authorized state. So we're talking roughly 17, 18 years ago. In that program, or those elements, there are certain things that we refer to under the Regional Water Quality Control Board as a designated waste. And it's a waste that has hazardous components, but they don't meet the definition of a hazardous waste in terms of toxicity or characteristic. And if I have contaminated soil with hydrocarbons, such as a TPH, we generally see that as a mandate in the permit for a lot of the Class 1 and Class 2 and Class 3 facilities throughout the state and in some instances federally. But TPH is not used to classify a hazardous waste, but TPH is used to identify if you have a waste that's below the radar. So it's not a hazardous waste federally. It's not a hazardous waste in California. It's a non-RCRA hazardous waste. We may call that a designated waste if we impose restrictions on where it can be disposed of. And a designated waste is similarly to an industrial waste. So kind of off the radar. We're not going to talk about it really this afternoon. And then we have extremely hazardous wastes. We have wastes that are toxic. And then we have wastes that are really toxic. And those are wastes that are really toxic. And those are identified by both a criteria, they have a threshold, and then we have about 278 that are excerpted with an asterisk that appears in Title 22, which is included in your handout material. And then we have non-RCRA hazardous waste. A non-RCRA hazardous waste is a hazardous waste defined by the state of California. And we're not the only state. There is roughly 6 other states west of the Mississippi, and there's about 7 others east of the Mississippi that also imposes certain types of management requirements on waste that are outside the federal program. So they're not a RCRA waste, but they're still managed as a hazardous waste in the state. So in California, a non-RCRA hazardous waste is a waste that's regulated by the state of California that's outside the domain of RCRA. And then we have wet test. And wet really should be an all-capital WET, because it's an acronym for waste extraction test. And the wet test is actually composed of 2 tests. Under the state California non-RCRA criteria, we talk about wastes that are characteristic wastes. And a waste that's a characteristic waste exhibits a characteristic, and for toxicity, the wet test is used to define whether or not these 40 chemicals, organic and some inorganic, actually ends up being a hazardous waste in California. And we go about it 2 different ways. One venue is to look at the soluble amount of the chemical component in the waste stream, and we call that the STLC. And the total threshold leachate concentration, or the TTLC, is the total amount of a certain component, organic or inorganic, that's actually inside or contained within my waste stream, whether it's a liquid or solid or a sludge or a gas. So, but a wet test, state definition. Federally, we're going to deal with something that's similarly to the STLC, but it's not the same. Excluded recyclable material is something that is excluded from the regulatory arena, and it's excluded from the Health and Safety Code, Section 25.143.2. And an excluded recyclable material is actually covered under what's called Paragraph D. And if you have a material that you use at your facility, it becomes a waste, and then you're going to reclaim it and recycle it and reuse it. And it's been used, bless you, it's spent, which means that without further use, you have to process it before you reclaim it and reuse it. That's spent, that's federal. So we can reclaim it and then reuse it at our facility. And we're allowed to do that. We have to mark it with the term called an excluded recyclable material, but it's something that it goes outside the domain of managing hazardous waste. It doesn't get manifested, it gets reused. And an example would be antifreeze. If I have a TTU that comes to my facility, takes my spent antifreeze and reclaims it, filters it, and then adds an additive after it's reclaimed, and I reuse it on site, that's a perfect example of an excluded recyclable material. So, but it's a state term. Now, there's been some recent federal legislation for excluded recyclable materials federally. It was promulgated here about 1.5 years ago, and it's currently going through litigation, and it has not been adjudicated. But a lot of what we do in the state of California in the Health and Safety Code for this exclusion was actually adopted federally by US EPA. But there's some differences that exist. And my discussions with Charles Cochran with DTSC 2 weeks ago, until that case is litigated and adjudicated, it's not going to change anything in the state of California. But there is federal movement to have excluded recyclable materials or excluded recyclable wastes federally, similarly to how we do it in the state of California. But right now, it's a state term. And then we have recyclable materials. A recyclable material, by definition, is a hazardous waste, and it's reclaimed or recycled. That's also some of the elements on how we manage it or what it is actually in the Health and Safety Code. And then a retrograde material is a material that has essentially been purchased or brought to a facility. I'm going to use it, but I never use it. and maybe it is dated, and there is an expiration date on the material, and I don't use it by the time that the expiration date comes and passes, and so now I have to make a decision on whether or not I can continue to use it for its original intended purpose. And so while I'm in that process of determining that, within a year, it's classified in the state of California as a retrograde material. Not subject to hazardous waste regulations until we determine we can use it as a material, or we're going to relinquish it or discard it. It becomes a waste. I'm sorry? From the expiration date for that material that you purchased. So if it's a latex paint or epoxy resin or sealant or a caulk material or silicone used by October 2012, November of 2012, we've got from the end of October, November 1st, 2012, for a year to determine whether or not we can continue to use it or we can't. And then surplus material, I buy paint or a epoxy resin or a sealant, and I buy too much of it. So I'm going to use it later on. We'll call it surplus. It's not a waste. I haven't decided to relinquish it or get rid of it. I just purchased more than I needed. I'm going to paint the room. I need 16 gallons of paint for this room. I used 12. I got 4 gallons at surplus. It's kind of off the radar, not something we're going to deal with unless I was going to relinquish it. And then we have special wastes. Special wastes are wastes defined as a hazardous waste in the state of California. And if I have concurrence from DTSC, I can take a special waste and I can take it out of some of the regulatory requirements in terms of where I send it for disposal and how it's shipped. Like on a uniform hazardous waste manifest, I can put it on a bill of lading. So it helps reduce some of my fees. Special wastes, there's certain criteria they have to meet. We'll discuss that as well. But these are all state terms for managing hazardous waste, not federal. Flip the coin, turn it over on the other side. We got federal terms. So we have acutely hazardous waste. Acutely hazardous waste was predominantly born from the pesticide industry. Now you have to understand, RCRA was first envisioned in 73, 74. It was kind of written 75, and then we actually passed it in 76. So a lot of the pesticide industry, where we use things like 2,4,5-triphenylphenoxyacetic acid or DDT or a lot of pesticide materials, some of those back then, and even to this day, were considered to be fairly toxic. So EPA decided that if you had a material contained in a drum, vessel, or a container, and you were going to dispose of it, it's a hazardous waste unless you triple rinse it. And our triple rinse rule that we hear so much about was actually born from those acutely hazardous wastes federally that were listed by US EPA. If they were contained in a container, and I'm going to discard the container, that container is a hazardous waste unless it's triple rinsed. And you have to rinse it with a suitable diluent to dissolve the constituents or the residues. But those are wastes that are really toxic, where hazardous wastes are toxic. So acutely hazardous wastes federally are identified where they're a sole active constituent, and they're listed under the P code that's actually listed in the appendices to your handout. So we'll go through that this afternoon. And then we have hazardous wastes. Same concept, same idea. Like a P waste that's acutely hazardous, these are unused, unspent formulations. I haven't used it. I buy it, I store it, I change my process, and now I'm going to get rid of it. And so that's a candidate for being a P or U waste. It's not that it always is. Sometimes it's not. But if you have used something, used is defined by the state of California. Spent is defined federally. And if something has been used and no longer can be used for the purpose for which it was produced without process, recycling, reclamation, or the like, then that is something that's considered spent. And P and U wastes are unspent formulations. They've not been used. They don't need further processing. Whereas hazardous wastes, which are the F and the K codes, which are from specific source and non-specific source venues or processes, those wastes have been used and they're spent. And when I take my different materials that I use in a particular process and I collect the waste that's produced from the process, that waste that is collected comes from a process where those chemicals have been used and spent, and those are candidates for F codes and K coded federal RCRA waste. And then hazardous wastes, then federally, we have 4 predominant characteristics. We have waste that's considered to be ignitable, corrosive, reactive, and toxic. Similarly, the state of California, we have wastes that are considered to be, ready? Ignitable, corrosive, reactive, and toxic. And it's essentially the same 4 characteristics by name. 2 of them are identical by definition, and there's differences that exist for the other 2. But both the state and the federal government actually have a characteristic for what defines a hazardous waste using a particular criteria. And those federal wastes all have what's called D codes assigned to them. So if it's ignitable, it's D001. If it's corrosive, it's D002. If it's reactive, it's D003, so on and so forth. And then we have categories or lists of generators, and we have 3 types of generators for those that produce or subject the waste to be managed as a hazardous waste. And we call those 3 categories either a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, or squeegee, large quantity generator, and then a small quantity generator. And those are federal terms that are defined federally under RCRA. RCRA hazardous waste means it's defined by RCRA. But not all federal waste is defined by RCRA. We have other federal wastes that are defined by TSCA and FFRA, but what we're going to focus on today is wastes regulated by RCRA. And then TCLIP. That is my waste hazardous federally under RCRA. And so what they do is they come up with a criteria for defining what a hazardous waste is, and that criteria for toxicity under RCRA uses the toxicity concentration leachate procedure, which was promulgated back in 1986, and it replaced the extraction procedure test methodology because the TCLP emulates the conditions that occur in the landfill that helped establish the LDRs when we passed TSWA. So we kind of went to this new venue, which is now roughly about 23, 24 years ago in terms of this toxicity. But TCLIP has a regulatory threshold for 38 different chemicals. Okay, then other terms. Personnel or facility personnel, people that work at a facility that is either a licensed facility, transfer facility, or generator, which would be a person that produces the waste or subjects the waste to becoming subject to hazardous waste. POTW, there are certain federal exclusions from certain management requirements for POTWs or individuals that discharge to them under the Clean Water Act. And then we have restricted wastes, and those are wastes that have established land disposal restrictions. And then we have universal wastes. And we have universal wastes federally defined, and we're fairly similar in the state of California to what a universal waste is, except we came up with how to recycle lead-acid batteries in '89. So how we recycle lead-acid batteries in '89 exists to this day. So we manage them similarly to a universal waste. We manage them very similarly to and transport them like universal waste, but they're just not a universal waste. If you went to any other state in the United States, they're a universal waste. But in California, they're not, because we have a recycling exemption if they're handled in such a way in which they're reclaimed or recycled. Okay, generator or producer. So, go figure. The law enforcement agencies of the United States are involved in 12 to 14,000 meth incidences a year where people are producing, manufacturing meth. They didn't buy it. This is law enforcement. They didn't buy it, didn't use it, don't want it. But when they seize property and they remove the materials used in manufacturing, they subject those materials or wastes to disposal. And they subject those acids, solvents, caustics, and certain reactive materials to be disposed of meets the definition of a hazardous waste. They're a producer. They're a generator. So it's whoever agency, individual, entity, organization that subjects waste to being managed as hazardous waste, that's the producer. They may not have used it, won it, bought it. It may be abandoned on my property, and when I actually go to manage it, I become subjecting that waste to disposal. I become the generator, the producer. Then we have the three categories that I mentioned earlier. So that's generator, producer. And then in your handout, on the first several pages after your red slip sheet, I list kind of an overview of hazardous waste management, and on the bottom of the first page and on the top of the second page, I give you the California definition of what a waste is, and then eventually I'm going to define what a hazardous waste is. So waste, by definition, it means any discarded material of any form, liquid, solid, semi-solid, gas, or sludge, that is not excluded by Section 66261.4A or E, or that is not excluded by the Health and Safety Code. And this is 265 or 25143.2. These are some of the regulatory exclusions for excluded recyclables. Examples include, and then we have them listed there. Those are examples of California hazardous waste. And some of these are examples potentially of federal waste, but most of these are California waste. That's a waste. If you look in your book past the red slip sheet, and you look on the very top of the following page, it really kind of defines this in a nutshell. And it goes on to say that a waste that is subject to regulation is a waste that is discarded. A discarded material, by definition, is any material that's been relinquished. Relinquished is defined as anything that is disposed of, burned, incinerated, or accumulated or stored or treated but not recycled, before or in lieu of being relinquished or being disposed of, burned, or incinerated. So, and a material is also considered to be recyclable. It goes on to state essentially the definition of recycling. So if I buy something and I use it in my facility and I can continue to use it without processing it, so it's not spent. It's used, not spent. So it's not spent, not subject to being hazardous waste federally under RCRA, potentially, but it's used at my facility. And if it's been used at my facility and I actually go to use it further for some other process and reclaim it after I've used it a second time, that's a definition of an excluded recyclable material. We find that in the Health and Safety Code. All right. There's about 75 people in here. We okay? You ready? All right. Okay, so is my waste hazardous? Is something that I'm getting rid of, I've relinquished, I'm going to dispose of, or have it recycled or reclaimed, I'm going to get rid of it from my facility, is that waste a hazardous waste? So the first question is, well, is it waste? There are certain things that have been determined that they're not a waste yet, and if it's not a waste, it doesn't have the opportunity for being defined as a hazardous waste. And there's exceptions to that. You have, as a producer or generator of waste, you essentially have different ways of identifying whether or not your waste is hazardous. A waste that you relinquish, that you intend to send offsite for disposal, you can, without any regulatory requirements, you can apply your knowledge to that waste stream. I use predominantly acetone. Acetone has a flash point below 140. It's predominantly acetone that's contaminated. I know it's ignitable. I don't have to test for that. That's generator knowledge. Or it's mixed with methanol, but the two of them, methanol has a flash point of 74, it's still a hazardous waste. So applying generator knowledge is fairly common that we see in industry as a whole. Characteristics. I'm not certain, so I'll test for it. So when you look for certain types of metals or bioaccumulative substances that are organic, or certain characteristics, these can be tested for using the test methodology defined in Title 22, which is SW846. Okay? And you don't have to declare it or test for a characteristic. It may be listed. If you look at the federal scheme of things, we've yet to talk about, certain waste streams that come from a process are listed. And if they come from a process that's listed, that waste that's produced from that process is captured federally as a RCRA hazardous waste. Now I can uncapture it, but in those instances it's captured. And then we have something called the mixture rule. It doesn't really apply to a lot of what we do in the state of California, because a lot of the things that are required or can occur federally under the mixture rule, we consider it treatment in California, so we wouldn't be able to subscribe to that unless we actually had a tiered permit. So, but I'll cover the mixture rule as well. Okay, so I want to determine whether my waste is a hazardous waste. So you're asked to look for, check first to see if there is an exclusion. And there are certain federal exclusions, there are certain state exclusions for hazardous waste. For example, certain processes that take spent sulfuric acid to regenerate sulfuric acid, that sulfuric acid that's used for regeneration purposes is excluded federally from being a hazardous waste if it's used to produce and manufacture sulfuric acid. Household hazardous waste. It's excluded federally from RCRA. It's not excluded from the state of California, though. So household hazardous waste is a hazardous waste, is excluded federally. It's not a RCRA waste, but it's actually captured in the state of California. And technically, it doesn't exempt homeowners. So even we can't take certain materials, put them in our garbage can, but from enforcement, we just don't typically see that. We take it to a household hazardous waste event or a collection facility, and they then manage it as a hazardous waste. Most of those end up being managed as a universal waste. But, yeah, question? Yes? Yes. Give me an example. What are you going to do with it? Okay, you don't want it, so you want to relinquish it. Has all the elements of being a waste. So that's a commodity. That's a commodity. Does it have utilitarian value? Paint? Okay, you going to sell it or give it? Give it to him. Okay. Are you giving it to him to avoid regulations, or are you giving it to him to be a good Samaritan? There you go. So you're giving it to him to avoid managing this hazardous waste. Okay. Yeah, it is. But you're not actually asking for compensation or enumeration for it. You're giving it to him. Well, I'm playing the shell game because there's nothing definitive. Because if there is commercial value, and if the commercial value that your neighbor is going to use that for is the exact same commercial value you purchased it, I think we're going to find ourselves okay. If by chance that commercial value is going to be used for something else other than what you originally had purchased or for what it was originally produced for, now we're getting in the gray area. And you're avoiding having to pay fees for relinquishing it or having it disposed of. It's a little more gray. And you didn't ask a nickel for it. You gave it to him. Really gray. So, and if his use of that material has direct and earthen contact, so there's direct contact of the ground, how he uses it. So he takes the material and he makes sandstone, walking stones for gardens, and you walk on it, but it has certain types of components of heavy metals in it, then that potentially could even constitute disposal, which is illegal disposal on his part, or actually it's a commodity, it's a material, but it's disposal on your part. It did. It did. It was pretty useful. Well, this federal exclusion that is now being litigated is addressing some of that. What essentially it's saying is that if you can relinquish your waste federally under RCRA, because our 25143.2 ABCD only applies to non-RCRA hazardous waste. So if it's a RCRA waste, we're off the radar screen. But under the current promulgated federal guidelines that was finalized, that's now being litigated, it allows for us to send our waste to an off-site facility to have it reclaimed if it's tolled. And tolling means I have an agreement with them to manage it. And where it's being litigated is that a lot of the transfer facilities and TSD facilities are seeing this as a potential non-windfall because they have licensed facilities to manage that type of waste that they're not going to see anymore because it can be used in another industry or processed at a facility that can use it itself. So it's taken a lot of waste that would otherwise go to a licensed facility. But that tolling is what's actually being adjudicated. Yeah. But we used to have that. But that's what's trying to be accomplished by this new regulatory exemption federally under RCRA. Yeah. Yeah. So I didn't want to have to pay for disposal, so I gave it to a person. That by itself doesn't alleviate liability. It's kind of gray area, but he can use it. He doesn't have to process it, so he doesn't have to be a treatment facility. It's commercial value, and he paid me for it. Well, that's no different than I'm selling him my excess paint. The extra 4 gallons that I don't want, I'll sell it to you. Instead of $6 a gallon, I'll give it to you for $3 a gallon. Then there's commercial value. He recognizes it. I recognize that. It's surplus. It's surplus. Yeah. 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 Okay, so 4 types of hazardous waste. We're going to go through this afternoon. So there's certain exclusions, and I think I list some of them for you. Check whether or not a waste is listed, which we'll talk about. And if I have a waste and it's listed, it's captured. California only has one really category of listed waste, and those are your mercury. Those are the M-listed wastes. Those are California listed wastes. Federally, we have lots of categories, and they're generally industry-specific or chemical-specific. It depends on if it's a non-source or source waste stream. We'll talk about that here probably after the break instead of before, but there's listings federally, and if it's listed, it's captured. Now, there's ways we can pull it out of that regulatory arena, and we do. People do. Because some of the federal listed waste streams are listed solely because they exhibit a particular characteristic, such as either it's ignitable, or it's corrosive, or it's reactive. And if I test for that sole characteristic for why it's listed, and it doesn't exhibit that characteristic, then I can petition US EPA and I can pull it out of the regulatory arena. And that actually is something that was passed almost 10 years ago to the day. And we do that. People do that. And it just depends on, do I produce a little bit of this or a lot of this in terms of cost benefit. So we'll talk about listed. And then you have to determine whether or not a waste exhibits a hazardous waste characteristic, state and federal, and that's the intent of this program. What's the federal? What's the state? What are some of the differences? Okay, so we have exclusions. I was talking about these a moment ago. There are certain recycling exclusions. Certain mining waste is excluded. Certain wastes that are produced from mining operations federally are excluded. Household hazardous wastes are excluded federally, but not in California. Excluded recyclable materials are excluded. Those are California. That's out in the Health and Safety Code. But to make life pretty easy for you, if you don't have an exclusion, or if your waste isn't being reclaimed or recycled and reused, either by yourself or another facility, probably it's not excluded. Even oil, other than the new oil exclusion requirements where the transporter tests it, most of that waste that goes out under the consolidated manifest that's a hazardous waste, probably most of those end up being a non-RCRA hazardous waste. There's a lot of categories of waste that are excluded. There's a lot of exemptions and exclusions from whether it's a hazardous waste if you manage it elsewhere, like our universal waste. But those are pretty industry specific. Generally speaking, there's a fact sheet put out by DTSC on a lot of these exceptions to the rules for those wastes that exist with the regulatory exclusion. Say we have a waste stream that's not. It's not one of those. Well, then what we do is we look and see if there's any exemptions. It turns out that for wastes that I produce at my facility that has dibenzofurans or dioxins or whatever, or I think it has PCBs, or I'm going to send it to the facility and look for TCA, or TCE is contaminated soil or groundwater. Well, when you send a sample to an environmental lab, it's a sample of a waste, maybe a hazardous waste, but because there's utilitarian value in the sample, and because the sample is going to be analyzed, it's a commodity, and it's exempted from being a hazardous waste. It's coming from a waste. We don't know if it's hazardous, but we don't manifest it. There's an exemption that actually applies to that, and it's not so much an exemption. It's an exemption that actually appears in the Health and Safety Code. There we go. Okay. Let's go back to gray. 500 mils? A pint? A quart? 55 gallons. Yeah. 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 Your gray went to being pretty dark. Okay. Quart, pint, 500 mils, 30 mils. If we're going to shoot on a GCMS, we need about, what, 3 mils? Yeah. 55 gallons? It's probably above the threshold. And how you ship it, whether it's by IATA or DOT on the ground or like, there's exceptions to the rules in terms of how you package it. And by the time we get above a quart, we're kind of outside that whole domain for how it's transported and the like. Yeah. And it says environmental samples doesn't give you size here, but DOT and IATA regulate how big that can be when you ship it in the ice chest. Yeah. So, quart, pint, 500 mils, 1,000 liters, 1,000 milliliters, we're in good shape. Yeah, 55 gallons. No. Although, not that I didn't work at a licensed facility back in '82, and not that we didn't have some dioxin, and not that we didn't send it to 4 different analytical labs for testing, and not that we didn't have any more of it. But I'm not saying that happened, but I'm just saying that people have looked at that as an option. All right, hazardous waste. So what we're going to define, what we're going to talk about federally under RCRA is found in 40 CFR. And 40 CFR is essentially codified in California, and so it's both a state and federal waste, but we regulate it, we manage it, we dispose of it as a federal waste under RCRA. But we find RCRA waste defined in 40 CFR. And those are those 4 categories that we're going to talk about. California. If it's a hazardous waste and it's not RCRA, it's probably a non-RCRA. And certain non-RCRA hazardous wastes are subject to federal regulation. Not so much FIFRA, but we have certain types of wastes, example would be PCBs, regulated by TSCA above 5, at 50 parts per million. But if it's between 5 and 50, not regulated by TSCA, but we call it a non-RCRA hazardous waste. But certain non-RCRA hazardous wastes that we actually manifest and ship off-site for disposal may also be subject to other requirements. And so I'm not talking about Air Board, Water Board, TSCA, FIFRA. I'm just talking about California wastes are generally those that are outside the domain of RCRA, and they're captured because of some criteria that we'll talk about. So if I was to give you an imprint, this is it. If you can imprint this slide for the next 3 hours, no, 2 hours and 20 minutes plus a break, I'm going to dissect it and put it back together, and then we can do some exceptions or examples for you to help you out. But this is what this is what we're going to actually shred apart, dissect, shove it back together again. The way it's written in Title 22, it's commingled. It's commingled. So what I have done in your handout, where it's a criteria for both the state and the federal government, non-RCRA and RCRA, in bold print, I say this is a RCRA and non-RCRA criteria, both. If after a certain criteria is listed in your book, in the back of that red slip sheet, if it's a RCRA criteria only, it'll say RCRA only. If it's a non-RCRA criteria, California, it says non-RCRA criteria only. So I kind of break it apart so you can see it's state or if it's federal. But in either instance, if it's captured, state or federal or both, that's a hazardous waste. It becomes and is produced and it's managed as a hazardous waste in the state of California.